Wales. So what really lies behind the record number of sexual offences recorded by forces? To what extent has online offending replaced burglary, theft and car crime? What difference will recent changes in police recording practices make to the figures? What are the latest trends in antisocial behaviour? So we're going to hear in a few moments from Dr. Rick Muir of the Police Foundation, and then have a panel discussion to look at the various angles on all of this. We'll be welcoming, I'm hoping they're being mic'd up now and are ready to come, but if the panel would like to come to the stage, and very happy to welcome Rick Muir from the Police Foundation, who will give us a snapshot of all the latest statistics. Please welcome them.
Thanks very much, Julie. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. It's been a frenetic few days politically, but I'm going to try in the next 20 minutes to take a step back and look at some of the longer-term trends which are shaping the context in which policing has to operate, particularly focusing on crime. So I'm going to talk about three things specifically. One is what's happening to crime. The second is what's been happening to the criminal justice system. And the third is what's happened to the police workforce. And I'm going to draw out a number of insights from the data. So looking at crime then, this is the data from the Crime Survey for England and Wales. And I think Chris Philp, the Minister, is absolutely right. This is the best source we have for what's actually going on in terms of crime out there. And what you can see from this chart is that crime has fallen quite significantly since the mid-1990s. In particular, traditional crime, what I'm going to call traditional crime, and I'll explain that in a moment, has fallen by 75% since the mid-1990s. And that's true if you look at violent crime, which has fallen pretty dramatically overall since the mid-1990s. It's also true of theft and pretty much all forms of acquisitive crime, which have fallen fairly significantly over that period. Burglary down 80%, car theft down by 75%, and so on. So this is a significant drop in volume crime, which has happened over the last 30 years. It's happened, by the way, in almost all developed countries, which tells us something about what might be driving it. In other words, it's something that might not be unique to each country, but might be something that's driving change across these societies. But if we go back to the first slide, we'll see that some of what's happened is actually a shift online. So once you include in the crime survey computer misuse and fraud offences, which weren't previously asked about, when they included those offences, you see this large orange blob here, which shows you that when you add in fraud and computer misuse offences, the drop in crime has not been as significant as it first looked. And in fact, what we've seen is a shift in crime into the online environment. Crime is still less than it was 30 years ago, but there's also been a significant shift online. And in the very latest figures, 50% of all crimes experienced by people in England and Wales over the age of 16 were just fraud and computer misuse offences. And that is a complete transformation of the nature of crime, which our policing system was not set up really to deal with. So, but one of the things that we should focus on is why people often talk about crime going up in the context in which the most accurate figures show that it's going down. And this is, of course, because recorded crime has been going up. All the crimes recorded to the police. And most of that is because of changing recording practices. The fact that the police have to record and have been asked to record more and more offences which they previously didn't record, offences which are perhaps secondary to investigation but which they previously weren't recording, they now are recording. And so you get this inflation in the figures. Also within that, of course, is that there are some crimes which were not previously reported by the public, but which are now being reported. And I'll come back to those in a minute. So recorded crime has been going up. That doesn't mean crime is going up. It means more things are being reported to the police. And of course, what that does do, however, is it has a big impact on demand on policing because you're recording more crime and that involves more work for the police. You will see, of course, the drop in the recorded crime figures during the pandemic in the top right hand of that chart, and we'll see that with pretty much all forms of recorded crime, which I'm going to talk about. Now, one thing which it's worth reflecting on is that even though, as I said, violence overall has fallen quite a lot over the last 30 years, some forms of violence have increased in the last few years, and that's particularly serious violence which affects a relatively small number of people, but obviously affects them in a very significant way. And we're talking here about serious violent crime. That has gone up, and you can see here the figures on knife crime, which went up, fell during the pandemic, and have then gone up again. Firearms offences, much lower actually than they were in the mid-2000s, but again we see this sort of increase in firearms offences from about 2015 onwards, and then a drop during the pandemic, and then it starts to increase again. And homicide, again, much lower than it was at the turn of the century, but something of an increase in that period from 2015 onwards, and then a drop during the pandemic. So what that tells us, I think, is that violent crime is down, but serious violent crime has increased in the last few years. And by the way, police recorded crime is a good indicator of these very serious offences, because the crime survey finds it harder to deal with lower volume crimes that affect relatively smaller numbers of people. And of course, the crime survey doesn't include homicide, because obviously you can't ask members of the public if they've been murdered in the last 12 months. So police recorded crime is a good indicator for homicide. Sexual crime. This is the crime survey data on sexual crime. And what you see here is, over the long term, stability, actually. This is the percentage of people, predominantly women, who, responding to the crime survey, say they've been a victim of sexual crime. You'll see the figures for rape at the bottom there, where there's been pretty much stability over a almost 2-decade period in terms of the levels of rape. Sexual offences overall, a bit of a drop, then a bit of a rise, but we're still not back to where we were about 20 years ago. So the prevalence of sexual crime over a 20-year period has not increased. What has increased is the reporting of sexual crime, and of course that is a very positive thing. And you can see here, this basically starts with Jimmy Savile and Operation Yewtree, and after that, and of course aligned with that, you see the rise of the Me Too movement, and you can see then this huge increase, this more than trebling of sexual offences reported to the police. Now that's a positive thing, because it shows that more and more women in particular are willing to come forward and feel that the system will listen to them when they do. Domestic abuse, there's a sort of similar story, really. This is the prevalence of domestic abuse. So this is people in the crime survey saying they have been abused by a partner or someone within their household in the last year. And you'll see something of a drop in the late 2000s, and then a sort of gradual kind of decrease, although not a very substantive one since then. But police recorded domestic abuse has gone up in the last decade in particular. And of course, this comes back to what I was describing before about victims being more confident about coming forward and reporting. So again, a disjuncture between what the crime survey tells us is actually happening out there in society and what the police are having reported to them, because of a cultural change, a positive cultural change, that women in particular are more willing to come forward and report these crimes. Now, I'm going to have a look at antisocial behaviour now, and this is an interesting one, because there's a lot of sort of talk about antisocial behaviour politically, but most of the data on it seems to show that it's been going down over a 20-year period. So you can see here, these are police-recorded ASB incidents, and they've been falling pretty consistently since 2007-8, with an uptick during the pandemic, when you had a lot of officers, I think, being called out for COVID, suspected COVID breaches, but ended up dealing with them as ASB incidents. But post the pandemic, it's kind of gone back to where the trend previously. Now, you might say, is that just because the public think, well, they never respond to ASB, so, we've stopped reporting it? But actually, if you look at opinion polls on this, and this is the crime survey, you can see that actually the levels of perceived, high levels of antisocial behaviour that the public perceives in their community have been going down over a 30-year period. The blue line at the bottom shows the percentage of people who say there is a high level of antisocial behaviour in their neighbourhood, and that has more than halved in the last decade. You can also see there the percentage of people saying that teenagers hanging around on the streets is a big problem in their area. That's fallen. Maybe not too surprising, given that teenagers probably have more interesting things to do these days than hanging around on the streets, such as looking at their phones. And perceived levels of vandalism or graffiti or damage to property have also declined quite significantly. So actually, some of these things that have affected the quality of our public realm the public are saying, appear to be less of a problem. The exception to that, I think, is the line at the top, which is around people dealing drugs or using drugs in public spaces, where it went up a bit, went down a bit, but it's pretty much back to where it was in the mid-1990s. So definitely something about drug use and drug dealing in the public sphere is something which the public think is a concern. Now, I'm going to turn to the criminal justice system. And we heard from the Minister about wanting to prioritise charge rates and clear-up rates. And, of course, this chart is what he's referring to when he's saying that, which is the blue bars here are the percentage of reported crimes that lead to a charge or summons. And you can see that that has basically collapsed since 2015. Now, lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons might be that because the police have been recording more crime, and recording more quote-unquote trivial crimes or secondary crimes, that inflates the overall amount of recorded crime. A lot of that is never going to be pursued or investigated, and so your charge rate drops because you've increased the amount of crimes being recorded. It will be interesting to see when the government's new rules on crime recording come in that you would expect recorded crime to drop, and you would also expect the charge rate to go up. And so I would expect to see that as the figures come through. A bit of a drop in the use. You'll see out-of-court disposals, the orange bar, and informal out-of-court disposals, the grey bar, sort of go up and down a bit, but are used less than they were in 2015. Some significant changes there. The Minister was asked about the court backlog, and you can see the backlog here. This is cases outstanding at the magistrates' courts, and you can see, if you look towards the sort of the latter part of this chart, a huge increase in outstanding cases during the pandemic, which in the magistrates' court has gone down, but has not gone down to where it was before the pandemic. And then a very big problem in the Crown courts, where you see the number of outstanding cases had been falling up to 2018, then it went up a bit, and then it shot up during the pandemic, and it's kind of gone up a bit more since then. So a significant problem about justice being delayed in the system. Police workforce, we can see here, now here is the big political debate, and the Minister referred to it. The Minister said, rightly, that there is a historic, the number of police officers employed currently in England and Wales is higher than it's ever been, and he's absolutely right. And that is the orange chart here, which shows that the number of police officers is higher than it was in 2010 when this Conservative government came to power. The police workforce, which fell, obviously, that is the blue line at the top. The police workforce increased, you can see, as did police officer numbers during the Labour government. Then it fell during austerity, and then it has risen again with the 20,000 commitment made by the current Conservative government. But even though police officer numbers are at a historic high, the police workforce overall is still less than it was in 2010. And of course, that's because the 20,000 referred to warranted officers, not to police staff, and police staff numbers are still somewhat below what they were in 2010. So more cops, but somewhat less capacity in staff numbers, not much, but a bit than there was in 2010. Diversity, I thought it was important to reflect on what's happened to police workforce diversity, because I know this is something that will be discussed during the course of the conference. And you can see here a gradual increase in the percentage of officers from BME groups, just over 7% now. Although when you break that down, a lot of that is due to an increase in Asian British officers and officers of mixed ethnicity. Very little progress on the percentage of black officers, which is the bottom line. And of course that's significant because the racial group which has the least confidence by far, by a million miles in policing, is the Black Caribbean community. And we still see a bit of progress, but not very much progress in terms of the percentage of black officers. And if we go at this pace, we've done some work on this, if we go at the pace we're currently going at, it will, in the large urban forces, it will take something like 70 years to get to a representative police workforce, which is clearly far too long. Percentage of female officers has been going up by about a percentage point a year, every year. It's still around just below a third of all police officers are female. Obviously, if you add in police staff, it's something like more like 45% of police staff are female. Actually, internationally, we don't do too badly on percentage of women officers. England and Wales is the blue chart, tucked between Northern Ireland and Scotland, which basically have about the same levels. The only countries, developed countries around the world that do better than the UK on percentage of women officers are Sweden, Netherlands, and the Baltic states, where Lithuania, for example, is getting up to almost 40% of its officers being female. And actually, some big European countries do really badly. Portugal there on about 7%, Italy on about 7%, the United States on about 11%. So if you compare the UK to some of those countries, we do considerably better on percentage of women in the police workforce. Now, some final stats to just feed into the discussion. 91% of officers are currently working in frontline roles, or what are called frontline roles. There are getting on for 22,000 detectives, about 15% of police officers. But I have to say that is several thousand short of what police forces say they need. The last time we looked at this, it was about 8,000 short of the requirement. So a significant shortage in those working full-time on investigating crime, which, given the aspirations the Minister set out in terms of prosecutions and so on, is a considerable problem. 40% of officer time up to 40% of officer time, I should say, dealing with mental health incidents. Varies a lot. The data on that is not great, but it's clearly a very significant amount of officer time dealing with those incidents. And as was discussed in the earlier sessions, 36% of officers currently with less than 5 years service. So a much younger and more inexperienced workforce. So, the fact that it's a larger workforce in terms of officers is good, but it is also a younger and less experienced workforce. And of course, when you look at the percentage of inexperienced officers deployed in areas like response, that percentage would no doubt be much greater than that. And that, I would say, is a significant risk for policing as we look ahead, given all the issues about public confidence and so on. If you have officers there who are less experienced, I think common sense would tell you that is a risk that policing needs to deal with. So, just to sum up, in many ways, we're a safer society than we used to be. Less violent overall, less traditional acquisitive crime, looks like less antisocial behaviour, but a reasonably significant increase in serious violence in the last few years and a big shift in crime into the online environment. Second sort of conclusion, although sexual crime and domestic abuse have been broadly stable over 20 years, there's been a massive shift in reporting which has hugely transformed the nature of police work and of the work of the criminal justice system. Third conclusion, the criminal justice system is in crisis. There's been this collapse in charge rates. There's been this huge increase in the court backlog. And finally, a police workforce which is, in terms of officers, higher than it has ever been. In terms of the whole workforce getting back to its highest level, So strength in numbers, but some significant issues around experience and some significant skills gaps, such as in investigations, which need to be addressed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Rick, and for putting your contact details up so we've all got your phone number. Very useful. That was really very interesting and took us through a lot of subject areas. We've got a lot of turf to cover there. So how should forces respond to the changing mix of offending so that they have the resources and skills in the right areas? What should PCCs and chiefs do to ensure their uplift officers are focused on crime prevention and detection? What do we do about retaining those with experience, and how can forces build capability and experience at a time when other careers and opportunities might seem more appealing, knowing how tough a role many people find themselves in. So really delighted now to introduce our panel, who will give each will give us a sort of few minutes take on where they see the state of affairs at the moment. Alongside me, Festus Akibosoye, APCC Crime Prevention Lead, and also Bedfordshire PCC. Good to see you, Festus. Assistant Commissioner Louisa Rolfe from the Met, MPCC Crime Ops Lead. Alongside Louisa is Andy Cook. I'm just looking, I didn't say hello earlier. Hello, Andy. HM Chief Inspector of Constabulary Fire and Rescue Services, and also from the College of Policing, who have joined the conference for the first time as a headline service, Andy Marsh, Chief Constable Andy Marsh, who's the CEO of the College of Policing. Festus, if I can come to you first for your snapshot of where you think we're at from a PCC's point of view.
One of the things that I really feel very proud of is the role that police and crime commissioners are playing in ensuring that prevention is one of the key priorities on their police and crime plans. I think for the first time ever, pretty much every single police and crime plan now has prevention as one of the key priorities on there. In the past, I think about 25% in the previous cohort of police and crime commissioners had prevention on their plan, but now pretty much everyone is. And I think that very much underscores the fact that we are accepting once and for all that the solution to much of the public safety issues that we have in our communities can't just be about arresting people alone, and the public safety does not start in jails. It starts long before that. And so I'm really pleased that for the first time, more and more police and crime commissioners are making prevention an integral part of their police and crime plan and strategy for their policing areas.
Okay, thank you for that. Louisa, perhaps I'll come to you next.
So I think very much building on Festus's points that from a policing perspective, we need to ensure that we understand the crime threats we're dealing with. We have an understanding of how we prevent crime, how we are more demanding and challenging of others to help us in preventing crime. So I would have been really interested to see in Rick's slides the investment that others have made in crime prevention over that time period as well, because I certainly know that when you look at crime and safety reduction partnerships with local authorities, that austerity has not just affected policing, it's affected many of our partners as well, but also from a police workforce perspective. So whilst we know we have the challenge of insufficient numbers of investigators and detectives, there are many benefits to having a fresh workforce. We're increasing the diversity of our workforce. We're bringing in fresh perspectives. We're bringing in many young people with wonderful skills to deal with online crime as well. So we need to make the most of the workforce we have. But I think when I thought about this presentation, there were a number of things that sprung to mind for me. One around how offenders are influenced by what happens outside, opportunities and demand as well. So things like chop shops, the breakup of stolen cars, was not an issue until the insurance industry changed their approach to write-offs. So the point that cars became not broken up for parts anymore, but recategorized from N to S to anything else, it drove a demand for stolen car parts, and chop shops became a thing. So understanding how we can work with others to prevent crime is really important. In London, robbery is almost exclusively driven by the theft of mobile phones. We're working really hard with the industry at the moment, but we're not yet seeing enough efforts to prevent crimes being a sort of saleable commodity to others. So thinking about what drives crime and how we can sort of interrupt that offending more appropriately together with others too.
That's fascinating. Fascinating about the car crime, actually. That I hadn't appreciated. Thank you very much indeed for that. Andy, I'll come to you next. I mean, you haven't held back, have you, in your criticism of the state of charging rates and other areas of the whole of the criminal justice system. What's your take on what we've just heard from Rick?
Yeah, no, I think I set out in State of Policing what I believe to be the key issues around policing, and I think the vast majority of that was accepted by most people within the sector. I think it's really important that there's a greater consistency across policing in England and Wales. I mean, we see, as Rick mentioned, and sorry, it was mentioned before as well, that some forces are treble the number of detections, number of charges, and other forces. That can't be right. There's a problem. So I think for me, I mean, there's numerous points I could pick out around it, but if I just focus on that prioritisation, that planning, and that really getting a grip on performance. We issued a spotlight a few months ago, which was called Getting a Grip, and we are just not seeing sufficient work being done to ensure that that targeting of the right issues that the public would expect, as well as the issues that we know policing needs to deal with, the more hidden issues, is just not consistent enough, and it is not collaborative enough in many ways. The issue that was discussed before in relation to public confidence and trust in policing, yes, I made some scathing comments in State of Policing around it, but this certainly isn't the time for self-congratulation for policing or police and crime commissioners, because with the resources that policing has, it is still not keeping communities safe enough, and we can't get away from that fact. There's some outstanding work goes on every day across the country by police officers and police staff. Well, that consistency of approach isn't there, that focus and that grip isn't always there, and that's why we've had so many forces in Engage. That's why other forces are in danger of going into Engage at the moment. So there needs to be a real focus, real approach to what the key issues are, to solving them, and it's not all about crime, it's not about charge rates, I accept that. It is equally important to make sure that victims are given the opportunity to have the crimes dealt with in the way that they would like them to be dealt with, and out-of-court disposals are a massive part of that, but they've dropped by 50% as well over the last few years. One final point I'll make, really important that we get the National Crime Recording right, because it's not. It's too complex and too bureaucratic. But we can't forget either why those rules were implemented in the first place. If we go back to 2014, only 70% of all sexual offences were being properly recorded. At the end of last year, that was 98%. Now, that is a big difference in the number of victims who are actually receiving the care and attention that they should be getting. So the starting point was the right time to start what we were doing. Now is the time on National Crime Recording and similar issues to actually see if the balance is right, particularly for the victim.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. And I'll come to the other Andy now, Andy Marsh from the College of Policing. Given that your role is there to bring in a lot of these new officers who have to be very adaptable to this rapidly changing crime landscape, what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's really good to hear what I would call a factful analysis of the situation. Too much discourse, I think, occasionally on policing is driven by anecdote and stories. And people, and I'm not blaming the media for this, but people are sometimes drawn to the worst stories. Mm-hmm. And so if we root ourselves in the facts, we're much more likely to come up with a sensible diagnosis of what needs doing. So what does need doing? Well, I'm certainly not in any form of denial about there's a significant problem to solve in lots of respects. Including some other areas that Rick hasn't necessarily covered. So I think we all need to ask ourselves the question of, if we're to address the things that matter most, what capability and capacity do our workforce and our organisations need to have? That touches on people-related issues, it touches on technological-related issues, and of course, training and skills comes into this. Now, the role of the College of Policing is threefold, speaking in big handfuls. First of all, boost the professionalism of the service. Secondly, drive consistency across the service over the things that matter most, what Andy spoke about. And then thirdly, develop outstanding leadership at every level. So these three things are particularly important when we're seeking to bridge a deficit around the capability of our new recruits. Almost half of our frontline workforce is less than 3 years in experience. the ability of our detectives and our Soteria and rape investigators to bridge the gap that we need to on that. But I would say that third big idea of leadership is the thing that makes everything better, full stop. And let's not ignore the ability of leadership to make sure that we're attracting and retaining the right people, as well as ensuring we extract the best from them every day we can at work. Now, I work closely with Andy and other system leaders around driving maximum performance out of policing. I don't think enough investment is made centrally on driving up performance when you compare us to other sectors. But what Andy's reports do is shine a light on some things which, if you pay attention to, they seem to go well. And I'll just throw a couple of them in it, because I build the college's delivery around this. The first is leadership. Forces invest in leadership seem to do well. And the second is ability to solve problems strategically and tactically. Tactically, I mean operationally. Strategically, I mean, for example, managing things like demand. So finally, the thing that the College of Policing needs to do to step up to this challenge, because we must deliver. I would argue that a college is needed now more than ever before. We've got to be relevant to the things that matter most, these problems. We've got to be dynamic to keep up with the sector, and we've got to be connected to everyone, from frontline officers through to police and crime commissioners and their teams.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's quite a big list to get through there, and it was really interesting to see how Rick was anchoring so much of it in those very clear statistics. A lot of questions coming in on Slido. Get ready to put your hand up if you have a question from the floor as well. But I just wanted to pick up from something, I think it's sort of pertinent to something everybody has said here from the figures that Rick shared with us, is this gap between the reality and perception. I was quite struck by the figures on antisocial behaviour. I mean, from a sort of political point of view, that's quite a difficult gap to bridge, isn't it? When you're accountable to your communities who may have this perception about, what's happening on their streets and what they feel needs to be done to respond to it, and when the figures are quite separate. I mean, how do you deal with that?
With difficulty. And I'm not the only one, and I think even police chiefs have the same. But for police and crime commissioners, such as myself, it is a difficult one to have that kind of dialogue sometimes with residents. And the reality is this: people's reality is their reality. And sometimes perception impacts on reality more than the facts impacts on reality. Yesterday, I was at a full council meeting in Bedfordshire, where I had a councillor said to me that crime has gone through the roof, the world is in crisis, and everything is terrible, and we've got less police now than we've ever had before, and woe is me, and we're all going to hell in a handcart. I then presented those facts that you've just shared to him. I also shared the facts that we now have more police officers in Bedfordshire Police's history than we've ever had before, even before 2010, before the austerity kicked in. No word of a lie, this councillor, point blank in front of everyone, pretty much told me that I was on a different planet. And I'm sure many of us in this room would have had this kind of exchange with other councillors or residents in our local area. But look, I see that my job and that of my colleagues as not to try and tell people that they are deluded, or you will not get elected, or you probably get sacked.
Maybe not the right strategy.
Probably not the right thing to do. I think policing generally, including police and crime commissioners and police chiefs, we must do a better job in sharing those kind of facts with our public. Not to tell them that what they are seeing or what they're feeling is invalid. We can, in a way, we can provide support for that, but also let them know what the facts actually show and how those data is driving the operational decisions that chiefs are making.
Yeah, and I suppose that goes to where officers are allocated to when you're working with PCCs, Louisa.
Yes, definitely. And I think what we've seen over the last few years is how one singular case or a number of high-profile cases can hugely affect people's perceptions and fear of crime. And certainly, antisocial behaviour is often a symptom of other offending behaviour. So certainly, we find across London, but I know this happens across the country, that street-based drug dealing will be a big driver of people's perceptions of fear in their community, but also it can drive other crime. And we know that that has changed over the last 20 years. In the 1990s, a lot of acquisitive crime was driven by heroin addiction. We know that that's changed very much now, but we must work with our communities. And some of the brilliant work that we've seen where officers work in partnership with local people to really get to the heart of crime-based issues, and that our investigators work closely with those local officers, we can make the biggest difference and biggest gains.
Okay, thank you. Keen to get some questions. Let's take one from the floor first. If anybody wants to raise their hand for a question. This gentleman here at the front, if we can get a microphone. And if you wouldn't mind, just once the microphone's there so people online can hear you as well, just introduce yourself so we know who you are. Just the gentleman here on the front. There we go.
Hello, can you hear me? Jeremy
Yes.
Vaughan, Chief Constable of South Wales Police. It's really brilliant presentation, because when you see good data and facts, it's just so compelling and draws out so much. Rick, I'm interested to know to what extent you're able to identify in any data the effect of complexity on the things that we deal with. So one stat, for example, might be the time people spend on the phone handling a call now. For us is probably about 80% more than it was 10 years ago, because we've had lots of events, inspections, oversight, scrutiny arrangements which get people to ask more questions, spend more time identifying things that they didn't think about before, A. B, 20 years ago, there are some offences that didn't exist. We weren't thinking about it, so people spend more time in custody suites, people spend more time being interviewed. We look at different things. So I guess going back to the point that John made a while ago about investment, is complexity understood well enough in our data?
Thank you. Maybe Rick, take that one first, and then anybody else wants to chime in.
Yeah, I mean, you can see it in the data. You can see it in various places in the data, Jeremy. I think that you can see it in the charge rates, actually, because another reason, which I didn't mention, why charge rates might have been going down is because of the more complex crime mix, which means that, we saw the number of sexual offences being reported shooting up. And of course, we know that they take significantly longer to investigate than a burglary or a car theft and so on. So you can see the complexity in bits of the data, but do we have good enough data to identify complexity in order to perhaps make a case to government for more money? Probably not, actually, is the honest answer to that, I think.
Okay, thank you. Andy Marsh, I think you wanted to come in as well.
I think data is, as Rick said, data is the lifeblood of problem solving, whether you're talking about an operational issue of antisocial behaviour or drug dealing or a strategic problem in a force. I would want to raise one fact, which I've heard Mark Rowley mention a few times. He says it takes 5 times as long now to create a prosecution file as it did 20 years ago. So there's a piece of data that does stand up, Jeremy, what you're saying. I pose a different question to the audience, really, for you to think about. I think policing is a dynamic and responsive profession, and I think we will do what the Minister's asked us to do and increase charging rates. What on earth is going to happen with the data that Rick's shown us on court backlogs and the ability of court to deal with the surge that we're about to create? Now, Donna mentioned it in her presentation. We can't really achieve anything in policing unless we work in partnership. Prevention being a case in point, Festus. But actually, unless this criminal justice system is sorted out, we are sailing towards a very big iceberg.
It's really interesting. It's something that's coming up in lots of questions. I'm going to come to another question, if I may, Louisa, because loads coming in on Slido, and I'm going to the ones that are getting the most likes. So this from Megan Jones. The data shows out-of-court disposals reducing. Could outcome 22 diversions, where suitable, being deemed as a positive outcome, help increase their use? Who'd like to take that one? A lot of nodding there. Yeah, Andy?
Yes, undoubtedly, and it needs to be the right resolution in the individual circumstance and predominantly aimed towards the victim. As long as it's not made too bureaucratic, as long as it's as easy as possible to complete, and as long as it's officer friendly in relation to it, absolutely it can make a difference. And it should be fully supported moving forward.
So I briefly, yes, it should make a difference, and I do think those disposals are underused. But this speaks to a dilemma, and I've been a chief since 2012. Back at the start of my tenure, we weren't trusted for delivering performance with integrity. There were stories about fiddling the figures. And I think we took our eye off the performance issues too much. And we're now in the situation we're in now. What should the public be able to expect? The public should be able to expect good performance with integrity. They're two sides of the same coin. They're not a choice. And actually, we should be able to deliver those outcomes with integrity, Andy. But of course, we need to keep an eye on it.
Okay, thank you. I'll take another one from the floor and just give a bit of time for the microphone to get there. And in the meantime, we'll ask one from Slido. Let me just have a quick look on here. Sorry, I'm just going to make sure I don't duplicate some of the subject matter. This question from Lee Jones. With the shift in crime to increasingly having an online element, it was a very striking first slide that you showed us, Rick. Do you have any research on the skills and resources available to tackle online and digital crime? I mean, this is a question for everybody, really, isn't it? It's about the speed of adaptability within forces now to recognise that huge shift that we saw from Rick's slide there. I don't know whether Louisa or Andy, you might like to take that one up.
So I think, yes, there's certainly an awful lot of work going on in policing in terms of the digital skills we require, but also this is often about how we work with others to understand where prevention opportunities lie. So I know, of course, policing had a lot to say about the Online Safety Act. There may be things within that we'd have liked to have gone further that might have helped us prevent some of the things, the awful crimes we see online, like online abuse of children. But yes, I mean, it's certainly something we grapple with daily in policing, and recognising that some of online crime is just an opportunity that's opened up that wasn't there before, and therefore this can add to our crime recording figures. But also it can be a key part of things like domestic abuse and sexual offending. You know, manipulative abusers will find opportunities to use technology. There's brilliant work that goes on in partnership with charities. So charities like Refuge, who have a whole team who look at tech-enabled abuse and work with policing to reduce that. So it's often about how we work with others and use their skills too.
It's amazing how multi-layered so much of this work really is. Just briefly,
I was just going to say, I mean, I think it's really impressive to see how some police forces are coming up with very innovative use of technology to actually speed up the whole process. I mean, so for example, we have these cyber triage vans that we now have in Bedfordshire that has actually helped us to reduce the backlog of some of the devices that we have that will be investigating by about 80%, to the situation now where a victim of rape who has had their mobile phone taken as part of the investigation can actually have the phone back within about 3 or 4 hours, whereas in the past, it was taking about 6 months. So we have more and more of this kind of technologies happening across all of policing in the country, and that's a really welcome thing as well.
Okay, thank you both very much for that. Next question, there's a lady there that's got the microphone. If you'd like to introduce yourself.
Oh, hello, I'm Sophie Linden, I'm Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime in London. Thanks a lot, Rick, really interesting, a fabulous amount of stats in there and facts. I just wanted to go back to that question really about context and the complexity, and why probably there is a mismatch between the public's expectations of what policing is going to deliver and the fact that we are at record numbers of police officer numbers. One, in London in particular, we may be at record numbers, but we are still below actually where we were when you take into consideration the population in London. So that will be one of the reasons between the mismatch and that complexity and the demand. It would be really interesting to be able to get some analysis of actually what is the gap in capability and capacity and the demand that policing is now having to tackle, because I think there is a big gap, and that will be why we're getting this mismatch between public expectations and where you've got record number of police officers. I also just want to sort of just a note of caution around women are much more confident of coming forward to report. I think, Andy, you said we did some research in MOPAC around that. Is it about confidence, increased confidence of women, or is it about what else is going on? And our research showed actually it was much more to do with police recording practices and getting a much better recording of the offences, rather than being able to rely on women being much more confident. There's a huge amount of work for the police to do in increasing that confidence of women.
Thank you. Who'd like to take that one on?
Well, on the complexity point, I think, yeah, absolutely. And you can see that in the workforce data. So you can see it when you look at skills gaps in the police workforce. So we've got this extra 20,000, lots more entry-level constables. But if you look at digital skills, if you look at investigatory skills, if you look at areas of growing demand, online child sexual abuse, digital forensics, areas like that, there are massive bottlenecks and massive shortages of skilled staff in those specialist areas. So there is, I think, a mismatch between the sort of workforce strategy, which is, more cops, but obviously younger, less experienced cops, and some of the real pinch points which require some real specialist skills to deal with the complexity.
Thank you, Rick. Andy Cook.
Yeah, just on the second point that Sophie raised, I fully agree with Sophie in relation to that. Any changes we make to National Crime Recording Standards have got to be totally victim-centred. It can't just be about reducing the bureaucracy and forgetting about why we're there in the first place, which is getting justice for victims and keeping victims safe. And I'm sure Chris Rowley, who's leading this work, won't do that, but certainly from an inspector perspective, we'll be having a very close eye in relation to making sure that's right.
Thank you. Andy, Martin.
So it's a point on the skills gap. So we have just refreshed the curriculum for the new entry routes, including the new police constable entry programme that I think is probably going to be trailblazed in Hampshire, Nottingham and the West Mids, is my understanding. And actually we have put a significant amount more material into it around digital investigation skills. But just one more point. We have got some great products on digital investigation. And there is I think a frustrating, and it's a point that Andy says, a frustrating inconsistency on the means to which they're delivered. So, for example, Modify modules 1 to 11, an online digital investigation skills pack, it's pretty much been rolled out to every single person in Merseyside Police, and yet some of the forces have barely opened it. We are taking an increasingly forward-leading role on professionalising the areas that chiefs and PCCs tell us, and the data tells us we need professionalising. So we made a commitment with Soteria to the Home Secretary to deliver 2,000 rate-trained investigators by April next year, and I believe that will be exceeded. But we're also embarking with the support of National Police Chiefs Council, and we need to make sure we cost it all so that we understand what we're getting ourselves into, a professionalising vulnerability programme around skills as well. So the service is moving, and there's much more to be done.
Okay, thank you. Very briefly, I know you're
I mean, given the size of his brain, it would be unwise for anyone to argue or disagree with Rick. But I would just, and I'm going to just try that now, but I think I just differ slightly in the risk that you see with having so many new recruits. I think actually there's a golden opportunity here for policing, and actually see this as a real chance to embed some of these new skills that you're talking about here with the help of the College of Policing. So it's not an entire disagreement, but just a slight...
little tilt on the
Yes,
tilt.
I think there's a real opportunity here.
Okay, thank you. Just going to go to a question on Slido. If somebody else wants to stick their hand up and we get a mic to them, the lady at the front here, then I'll come to you after I've done a couple of questions here. This is a very popular question. Those with confidence to join policing from black communities are often older. Is it time that our pay scales should be more flexible to recruit older people? Louisa, can I come to you on that? It's a really interesting question, isn't it? And I think, am I right in saying that in the uplift number of police officers, that there wasn't a metric within that to see how many were being recruited from ethnic minority groups? Is that correct?
So I believe there was, but I don't have the answer in terms of numbers, but I know
stand corrected on that. Thank you.
A huge. We saw it as a huge opportunity to take a leap forward in terms of diversity of our workforce and representation for communities. I mean, there's an awful lot to say about our pay scales and whether they are flexible enough to enable us to attract the people that we want to attract into policing and also then to reward them appropriately. It's not a question I've considered in terms of age, but certainly I know in our workforce in London that actually we have a huge range of recruits and ages, and of course the degree entry programme has been attractive for those leaving education, but we've also found a number of people, people come in with a range of life experience and skills and thrive. Policing, it's a career that grabs your heart because every day you have an opportunity to make a difference for people. You can solve crimes, you make a difference for victims, you can secure justice for them. It's incredibly rewarding, but I think we've got work to do in terms of our
It's that whole span of age and experience that presumably needs to be coming into full view.
I know you want to move on. So it's important to be factful about our workforce as well, and the facts are revealing on the Uplift programme. They're not all aged 18, 19 and 20, and they're certainly not snowflakes. So the average age of people coming on the degree internship, last time I checked, was 26. I've done a fair bit of work internationally in the last 2 years, But when I compare initial pay scales for Australian policing and US policing, they're a third to a half more than our initial recruit payment. And yet we still are attracting, as Gavin said, they're absolutely fantastic people that I would say are so much better prepared than I ever was when I started policing. The direct answer to the question, I do believe that pay needs to be reformed to better attract and mix and retain the right people and encourage the development of skills. But that's a big lump to
That's a
bite
big
off.
one, and
But
everybody's
needs
nodding.
doing.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I'll come to the floor in a tick. Emily Spurrell on Slido. Nature of crime is changing, but conversation with the public and focus on traditional crimes, she's put in inverted commas, hasn't changed. How do we shift focus to realities of day-to-day policing? And I suppose that comes back to the stats that we were talking about where we had that leaping off point. But I suppose that is about communication, isn't it? It's about how you communicate with your communities and how we make sure, or you all make sure, that the police, that the public really understand the landscape that you are all dealing with. Andy, you're nodding to take that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. I don't think you'll ever manage to do that to a great extent because the feelings of safety people feel within their own communities is a massive issue. So the public are, are wildly appreciative of the big things that policing does well, and it does an awful lot of those things well, and the things that policing needs to do that doesn't attract their attention, but things that happen on your doorstep, things that are happening every day, can really impact upon those feelings of safety. So you will always get that sort of community feel that the police need to be there, they need to be responsive, they need to be effective, and they need to be visible. So that effective neighbourhood policing is a crucial part of mentioned before, and I mentioned it in the state of policing. It's the bedrock of British policing, and it needs to remain that way, because that is the first thing that people always bring up. I remember going back many, many years, we used to do reassurance work, part of a government programme going back early 2000s. What were the big issues for the people of Liverpool at the time when you did a poll and got all the community in? Dog dirt, fly tipping, because that's what they saw. And the vandalism, the antisocial behaviour, and then just behind that was the burglary, robbery, etc., etc. No mention of the more serious things that policing deals with. Okay. So we'll never get away from those feelings of safety that people want to feel, either it's in the street or their own home, which is why it's so important, in my view, that policing continues to focus on them.
Okay, thank you very much. The lady who's got a question, just introduce yourself, please.
Kelly from Gwent Police, and also the MPC Chair for Workforce Coordination Committee. And I suppose it's a political challenge, but also wanting to really look to the future. We've got over 100 people online from the Executive Leadership Programme dialing in today, and they are the future leaders of policing. And, for me, it's about making sure that we are thinking broadly enough and to the future enough about some of the workforce challenges. And time again, we hear about police officer numbers, quite rightly so. And, of course, when looking at some of the data that you provided, Rick, what we see is the skills gaps are actually in police staff roles. And therefore, as we're preparing for, of course, general elections, PCC elections and the like, I suppose the question is, how are we collectively, yourselves as very much lead partners here and political leaders, really planning for the future? Because making sure that we have to stick to the uplift numbers, yet with lesser money to use, means that police staff numbers and police staff skills are actually being eroded in policing. And I see this as a real risk for policing for the very near future. And your thoughts on that, please.
Festus, do you want to take that up?
When the incredible amount of pay award was announced a couple of months ago, I remember speaking with the two Andys, actually, at the Bravery Awards. I think we were all surprised that the government went for the full recommendation from the pay review body. One of them that I actually remember asking our chief constable was, I hope we are going to use the same pay award rate for police staff as well. And, just to show that PCCs and chiefs can get along very well, there was no question that in our force, it was going to be exactly the same. Because for me, that perception was important for our police staff to recognize that they are seen just in the same light as the uniformed officers, because without them, the job of our police officers will be that much more difficult. So for me, in terms of how I choose to do things in our force with our chief, we have a level of parity for how we treat and want to train our police staff as how we do our police officers as well.
Okay, thank you. Louise C. wanted to come in.
So, Pam, I think this is a huge threat for us because we've talked about how we understand and prevent crime effectively. The bedrock of neighbourhood policing, our police community support officers, they are staff, they're not warranted officers, but also really understanding our crime threats, our intelligence analysts, responding to crime, as Festus described in rape, our forensic practitioners, our digital forensic experts. They are professional police staff, yet we're facing budget pressures that mean that we are, if we have to maintain those officer numbers, we have to make difficult choices about that bedrock that enables us to make best use of our omnicompetent officers to really target the crime threats and make the best of what we've got.
Thank you very much indeed. I think one quick one from the floor and then we'll conclude. And I know this conversation will continue beyond this session. Anybody want to raise their hands at this point? Or I'll take one from Slido. No, I'll take one from here. Rick, good to finish with you, given that we kicked off with you. From Matt Boyle, if we have a changing crime landscape and capability issues, what crime types should we tackle the most for the biggest impact on public confidence?
Wow, that's a difficult
million-dollar question.
That's a difficult question. Well, I mean, I think in terms of what crime types you tackle, I mean, clearly there are, the challenge here is that you have to do two things. One is you have to deal with the stuff that local people are really concerned about, and that absolutely has to be a focus. And in PCCs, I'm sure will be championing that, and it's really, really important. At the same time, you can't forget about other crimes which don't have as much kind of sort of political traction. I mean, fraud is the biggest crime affecting people in England and Wales, but nobody prioritises fraud, apart from City of London Police, who lead on it, obviously. But the response to 5 million frauds a year, and only 1% of the police workforce specialises in economic crime. So there's something of a mismatch between the problem that we've got and our response to it. Now, if you go out and ask the public, fraud, I don't know, maybe it's changing. Maybe people are saying we should deal more with fraud now. I think there is a bit of a shift. But there's a danger that it can't just be a popularity contest, I guess is what I'm saying. That you can't neglect victims of crime just because it doesn't turn up as the most important issue on the doorstep.
Thank you. Just a concluding thought very briefly, Andy.
So there is a very rich picture in the evidence base about what drives public confidence, but at the top of the evidence base is to tackle the issues of crime and antisocial behaviour that matter most in the neighbourhoods that people live in. That's the most important thing that we should do.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all of our panel. A round of applause for them, please, for all of their comments and insights. Can you just stay there for a second? Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Just another quick message. First of all, I need to show you a short film from one of our lunch sponsors at the summit, and it is from Content Guru.
When lives are on the line,
Emergency which service?
you can't afford to wait.
Do you need fire, police or ambulance?
Why then is responding to the public the poorest performing area in the Peel inspection programme? Recent Peel reports highlight how the public is being failed at the first point of contact, their call for help. Repeat and vulnerable callers are going unnoticed. Periods of high demand are poorly managed. Wait times for 101 are far too long. It's time to take action on contact management before it's too late. Surrey Police, Sussex Police, Police Scotland, British Transport Police, and more have all placed their trust in Content Guru to transform their contact management. And we can help you too. Content Guru's Storm platform is the first and only cloud contact management solution to deliver Police 999 and 101 services. In addition, every 999 ambulance call in Britain is handled by Content Guru, locating the best available call handler in the shortest time. When lives are on the line, you can't afford downtime. Content Guru's Storm Emergency Services Platform, or ESP, is a blue light only cloud contact management solution that guarantees more than 5 nines availability. The platform is securely operated and managed right here in the UK. Content Guru's cloud technology can overlay or completely replace your legacy contact management system, taking you into the smartphone age through video and photo sharing and precise caller location tracking. The solution's powerful onboard customer data platform captures important information from callers before, during, and after every interaction. Content Guru's AI-powered call transcription automatically takes notes and fills in forms, freeing your call handlers to handle more calls. Content Guru Storm also uses technology proven in NHS 111 to identify and prioritise repeat and vulnerable callers. The platform supports more than a dozen digital communication channels, so you can deliver a consistent service however the public wants to contact you. With so much opportunity for improvement, it's time to establish a new partnership between police and technology innovation experts. Content Guru offers a consultative approach to create, operate and iterate the contact management solution that's right for you. If you see these people, you are advised to approach them and find out more. Let's start rebuilding public trust together.
So, thank you to Content Guru, lots of other exhibitors in the Pickwick room for you to visit over lunchtime. A couple of quick messages before you depart. Just a reminder, please be back and ready so that we can start at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And we've had news that we are now expecting the Home Secretary tomorrow, so keep an eye on the running order for tomorrow because there'll be a slight change in the programme. But until then, have a lovely lunch. Thank you to everybody who's taken part this morning. We'll see you at 2 o'clock.